Ever wonder what it really takes to make zero trust work in practice? Welcome to Zero Trust Journey, the podcast that cuts through the noise and dives into real stories and strategies to bring zero trust to life. The cybersecurity world is flooded with buzzwords and vendor hype, but here we focus on what truly matters, practical insights and lessons from those who've walked the path. Each episode is inspired by real experiences, grounded in our research, and enriched by the challenges and triumphs of our guests. If you're ready to grow your skills, deepen your insights, and take actionable steps toward a stronger zero trust strategy, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. The views and opinions expressed on the Zero Trust Journey podcast webcast are solely those of the participants and do not represent the views of their employers or affiliated organizations. This content is provided for educational and informational purposes only. Neither the employers nor any sponsors are liable for actions taken based on the content discussed.
Everyone, welcome back to Zero Trust Journey. I'm your host, Zach Pugh, and here we do deep dives into zero trust concepts and strategies and gather real-world stories of successes and challenges from experts all over the world. Today, we're joined by Nemi George, a seasoned executive with extensive experience in information security, IT operations, and enterprise governance, where you currently oversee IT and business services for about 1,000 dental and medical practices across the U.S. And from my understanding, you're the president of the Orange Casaca chapter. So it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us, and welcome to the show. Is there anything else you'd like to plug about your background before we just kind of dive into a conversation about zero trust?
Well, just something that I think might be relevant as we carry on. As you mentioned, Zach, I have responsibility for security as well as operations. And so I always look at security from a lens of what is the impact to the organization, right? And when you talk about zero trust, as I'm sure we will, there's always that balance about making sure you're not introducing friction or you don't have policies that are overly restrictive or essentially get people to jump through hoops. And in our world, which is supporting medical doctors and clinicians, time is money. Everyone says that, but in our business, time is money. And so when you have a patient sitting in a chair or, a consult going on, that's not a time to kick someone out of access because they haven't ticked the right box or computer says no, as I like to put it. So I always look at security and operations, the user experience, and making sure we have that fine balance. So anyway, we'll unpick some of that as we go on.
Yeah, that's a great point. We talk quite often on this show about the challenges that leaders face in balancing security and user experience. So let's start by probing at that a little bit. How do you typically approach those kinds of situations where you have a security need to implement stricter security measures, but the user experience is going to suffer and time is money here? How are you kind of approaching those trade-off conversations and thoughts in your circles?
Well, I think that the first thing is understanding your organization. It sounds really basic when you think about it. And I think zero trust aside, a lot of security programs fail when you don't take the time to understand what matters to your business. As I sort of alluded to, within our organization, it's essentially pretty simple what we do. We onboard a clinician. We have to go through all host of processes, starting with credentialing, making sure that who they say they are. A lot of our systems require a level of training, certification prior to them gaining access. So it's not just about, you're onboarded and so now you have access to the system. Have you been trained? Have you been certified? Are you qualified to have access to all these systems? And then there's the business side of it. So we have certain clinicians who are owner doctors and others are associate doctors, as an example. The level of access an owner doctor requires, which would include financials, for instance, into their day-to-day business operation, is very different from the level of access that an associate would have, where in most cases, they just need access into the tools and the platforms for treating patients. And so when we think about access, it starts with understanding where the various personas across your organization. What is different between one role and the other? And it starts at the foundation of just cleaning up the roles, making sure you can identify that this person is in this role and therefore requires this level of access and this level of privilege, and building an automated process to understand the context behind all of that, which then ultimately goes into access provisioning, decommissioning, and elevating and, reducing rights based on the perceived or identified risk at a time.
And that's great. You're touching on a lot of different things there, but one of the things that stood out was a conversation we hear a lot with leaders, and that's about balancing or understanding the difference in a tech approach and a cultural approach, and trying to understand where your business is today, because checking that box for just zero trust, you have to understand what it means to your business. When I see companies thinking about zero trust as a tech upgrade, I see companies that treat it like a cultural transformation. Where does your organization fall on that spectrum? And, how did you socialize the change when you started thinking about zero trust as a concept?
For us, it's somewhere in the middle, tech versus cultural. And for us, it was more workflow process, which ultimately becomes culture, right? The way people do things repeatedly ends up defining or either enforcing, affirming the culture of the organization. And so going back to process mapping, understanding what's critical for the business, understanding all of that gave us the ability to say, if we do this as another bump in the road, another fog to fill, another tickets to be raised, this is not going to work. So one of the things that we set out to do from the very onset was building security into the various workflows, right? So this is a simple example. We use Workday, we use Okta, we use Pega. I'll just use those three high level to illustrate a point. Using Pega and the ability to map processes and simplify processes, we essentially created a sort of web front end where you can say, well, Zach is joining on this day as this role, and that will then trigger the role and all of that creation in Workday. Workday then feeds through Okta and Okta workflows to go do all the provisioning, not just for access, but also all the permissions, access, and the visibility that the role requires. Every subsequent change to your profile or to your role, and by profile here, just to give the listeners a little bit of context, you could be an owner doctor who works in one clinic, or you could work in 5 clinics. All of that has to be seamless in the provisioning of your access. And so we've been able to take very complex security workflows and essentially just build it into the everyday HR workflow, if you like. And so people are not having to go through an extra level of complexity or remember to do this and then fill out this form and all that other stuff. They're not having to do any of that. So it's critical that, especially just focusing on the listeners, think about well-established processes, governance gates, forums, whatever it is you have within your organization, and latch onto those rather than creating yet another, pit stop that people have to go through.
Oh, that's great insight for our listeners. A little bit of a more broad question about zero trust itself. We hear a lot of people talking about zero trust as the future, and it's the present, but it's also the future. We get a question a lot of, where do we even begin with this? There's so much out there. Where do we begin? And from your experience, what was the very first step that you took as an organization to actually move the needle on your zero trust journey?
Well, the very first thing, and this would be no surprise to most people, is just identifying and classifying your assets. And now that's not to be taken in the literal sense of physical assets, but everything of value within your organization. So people, users, application, data, systems, those are all assets. And you've got to start with this concept of who needs access to what and why. And it's very simple, but if you're able to define that, then that's your starting point. Now, the one thing I would always say is you've got to guard against over complexity when you're doing zero trust. Because if you take that simple statement of, and I'll tie a few things together here. If you take assets with the definition of assets that I use, which is devices, users, application, and data, and to some degree, the underlying network from which people are logging in from. If you then take that and then you try to map, almost visualize, build a mind map of all of those various objects together, and then try to put a policy framework over it, you'd be doing that for a whole year and not make a lot of progress. And so whilst all of those steps are required, the scoping of it is super important. You got to start small, right? Start with what is critical to you. So in our organization, there are a couple of systems. Our EMR system, we use Epic. That's one of them. Our financial system, that's another. Our reporting system of all the financial metrics for the various organizations, meaning business organization, but also the independent offices, clinics that we support. So we started there and we kind of built this process using a lot of the tools that I mentioned to ensure that we could, at the lowest level of granularity, determine who needs access to what based on their job roles, function, and all of those things, rather than trying to boil the ocean all at once. So that's kind of the first step. The second step after that is you've got to make sure that authentication is strong, right? So go for as strong and practical an authentication method as possible. And this is where some proponents of zero trust, there's some, arguments here and there, because some people would say, if you have mapped out in the first step your assets and classified your data, and you kind of know who's coming into your organization, and you don't necessarily need to put them through more hoops. So there's a balance there, but minimum, there should be some level of multifactor authentication. There's got to be some level of testing, trusting, and verifying the user before you grant access. To the degree that you do that, that is entirely up to your organization policy, right? Do you want people to re-authenticate every hour, every 2 days, every 2 weeks? That's based on your risk appetite and tolerance level, but there's got to be some level of authentication. And then you start getting into other things like, list privilege and the rest of it, grant people just the level of access that they require. And this applies to virtually every organization. But in the medical space, for instance, it's pretty huge, right? The fact that you work for a medical provider doesn't mean you should have carte blanche access to every system and everything. I kind of explain this to non-technical folks as refrigerator rights. The fact that I let you in my house doesn't mean you can go into my refrigerator and make yourself a sandwich. There's got to be some level of, yes, you've been authenticated, but there's a limit to the access that you have. And we oftentimes stop at just granting access and not worrying about the concept of list privilege to say, no, you really shouldn't have access all the way here. And these are the guardrails that we're going to put in place.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of great stuff for our listeners there. The first one that we highlight quite frequently on this podcast and, in some of our other groups is starting small. It's important for when you're building your zero trust strategy, there are going to be hiccups, just like any other security strategy. So starting small, taking your lessons learned, building on it from there. But the most important step that we always highlight is the same one that you did. Understand your assets. That's going to be the key one. And I would say out of the 15 CISOs that I've talked to in the last month, that's a challenge for nearly all of them is understanding and getting a full picture of their organizational assets. One of the topics you touched on at the end there was around multi-factor authentication and risk tolerance. We get a lot of pushback from some senior leadership teams that really don't want to deal with the headache that can come along with the multi-factor authentication because they say it slows down productivity. What strategies have you found in implementing that from the top down and ensuring that you don't have exceptions to those kinds of policies?
Well, it really, and a lot of these things, this is one of those topics where when you really boil it down, a lot of the principles and the concepts we're talking about, you can really narrow it down to, 5 or 6 bullet points. And the same thing applies to your question around multi-factor authentication. And this is kind of how I would explain it. It's got to be meaningful. It's got to be appropriate, and it cannot be a blanket one size fits all. Now, I'll give you some, again, most things zero trust, there are different schools of thought, right? So I'll try and play both sides of it. Now, one approach would say go blanket, right? So I'll take some applications here. If I was logging into Epic as an example, right? This is my patient practice management system. I want to know who is doing what when. I want the highest level of security within that application. If you were logging on, however, to submit your timesheets at the end of your shift, do I necessarily need the same level of rigor when you're logging into that application? You've got to make the level of control in line with the asset you're looking to secure, which is why zero trust, as well as every good security program, talks about assets and classification of the assets. The controls have got to step up or down based on that. So that's the first part of it. Now, there is an administrative burden if you were to apply context and say, I'm going to secure this application this way versus, a more relaxed or more stringent control this way. And so I can totally understand with people on the other side of the fence who would say, it's just easier to go one size fits all and apply the same level of security, whether you're logging on from your work computer or your personal computer or your iPad or whatever. But then again, going back to the principles of zero trust, some would argue that that is by definition zero trust. I don't trust you, whether you're coming in from a work computer or you're coming in from your iPad or you're sitting in Starbucks. The point is, you've got to validate and verify the level of access at the time of need. And if you're able to do that and apply context to say, you know what, I've seen that computer, I've seen that IP address, I've seen that MAC address, I have seen that user, he entered the password or she entered the password first time correctly every time. This account is not being brute force, or there's no account takeover going on, and this is not coming in from a suspicious IP address, and so on and so forth. So therefore, taking all of these things into account, I feel okay, right, about this challenge. Then I would step down the level of rigor or friction, if you like, and allow them to log in. That takes work. That takes discovery. That takes you having a well-architected framework to make that happen. But ultimately, to your point, Zach, if you go one size fits all, you risk introducing friction into the process. You risk essentially just putting up walls where they're not needed. If you try to be overly adaptive, which is ultimately what we all aspire to do, that requires a lot of work and a lot of resource and a lot of forethought, right, on your end prior to implementing it. So you've got to find the right balance.
Yeah, proportionate security measures to what you're trying to protect is always an important concept for people to keep in mind when they're implementing these types of security programs. One of the things that we were talking with another leader about recently was they indicated that their biggest zero trust hurdle was getting their board and the rest of their leadership team to sign off on this multi-year roadmap, this journey towards zero trust and where they wanted to go long term. In your case, did your leadership jump on board immediately, or did you have to win them over with specific strategy or maybe even a cautionary tale?
It was relatively easy, relatively being a keyword, because I think for us, zero trust was never about a massive investment to say, let's rip out and replace, or we need to buy all this extra level of technology. In a lot of cases, it was using the technology that we already have in a way that makes sense. So for instance, I mentioned Okta, Workday, and so on. Let's just focus in on Okta for a second. We implemented recently adaptive MFA as part of the Okta OIG SKU. And so we're using technology platforms that we already have. And then we're just saying, where do we need to turn up the dial a little bit here and there? So when you present security and controls, and I personally hate the word control, because just like every kid you tell not to do stuff, there's a part of them that just wants to push the boundary and see, why can't I do it? And for years, we just, in the security world at least, the number one, at least the top three in our vocabulary is control. We want to control people. We want to control this, and it just gets a little too much, and people they just feel the negative connotation of that. If you're able to turn the conversation from controls to more business enablement, and it's, look, I know you're super busy. Let's take a simple example, practical example of using Zero Trust with SASE, right? So we also use Netscope. If you're a CEO, and I know that, hey, you are 9 out of 10 times you access these applications, which for most CEOs, it's email and some type of reporting application, Power BI or whatever, right? Keeping track of, daily production numbers and so on and so forth. If you understand that, and you know that, look, the CEO is hardly going to be on his PC or his laptop. He's likely to be on his iPad. He's likely only going to need read-only access for a lot of what he's looking to do or she's looking to do. Let's just stop there. That context is super empowering, because now it's not very easy, but it's easier for me to say, all right, I'm going to build a workflow that says, if you meet this level of authentication, verification, whatever, I am going to let you in. And then here's a question that I always ask people. What's the worst that can happen? If you've configured that device so it's read-only, they cannot download things locally to the iPad and a bunch of things. So you have basic controls like, device integrity check-in, device health checks, and those types of things. Then you can, with some level of confidence, say, great, I'm going to let the CEO's iPad connect to XYZ to pull down this report or view this report with some level of confidence. If you don't have the context, then all of a sudden you're like, iPad in Starbucks is connecting to financial reports. I'm going to block because it's not on a corporate issued laptop and so on and so forth. But if he's only just viewing, then why block? So now everything that is said there takes time. It takes work, and critically for security people, requires us to get up and go speak to the business. And that's not something that we do very well. We tend to want to sit down and go through our little checklist and, policy, regulations, frameworks. NIST says this, HIPAA says that, and we just implement the controls. And then we get pushback and we wonder why.
Yeah, you touched on a really key one right there at the end that I want to highlight for our listeners, which is, to truly advance your zero trust strategy, you have to be speaking with your business counterparts. If security is not viewed as a needle mover for the business and is instead viewed as just a cost center, you're never going to make real meaningful progress in, changing the hearts and minds of those around you. I want to touch a little bit about, this concept of a passwordless future. I come from an IAM background a little while ago, and that was a big thing, and it still is. So are you planning at your organization for a day when your employees don't even have to worry about passwords and your teams don't have to worry about password resets? And what role do you kind of see your technology stack playing to enable that if you do?
So at this stage, and that's a great question, and one that I'm sure every medical doctor, especially in our business, so we have a lot of dentists. And in fact, again, I tell stories in security because that's the only way we get into the mind of the business. And I'll start with a quick story here, Zach. So quite a few years ago, we implemented timeout periods. And I wouldn't say what a timeout period is, but let's say we had a blanket timeout period for the entire organization. And there was an uproar from our clinicians, right? And it took me to just understand what the workflow was. I mean, I had seen it, of course, you go to the dentist, but it just never registered. So anyway, a dentist would need to log in to a computer, right? And when they're logging in on that computer, they have to take off the gloves, type in the passwords. They now have to wear a clean pair of gloves and go into a patient's mouth. If you time out that dentist in, say, 10 minutes, because that's your blanket policy across the organization, now dentist has to, if they're timed out, take off a pair of dirty gloves from our patient's mouth, type in password, new pair of gloves, back into the patient's mouth. You can imagine doing this, depending on what your timeout period is, multiple times per session. You're getting in the way of that clinician being productive. And so now we're working through, we have a live environment where this is not rolled out by any stretch, but we have a live environment that we're going to actually have a big reveal in April, where you get to log in once. And then after that, you just badge and go. And, badging has been around forever, but we're enhancing that. We're doing the badge authentication. And in addition to the badge authentication, we want to integrate biometrics, and we also want to do proximity scans. And the idea behind the proximity scans is, if you were to walk away and you had sensitive information, for instance, on your screen, then rather than locking your screen, it simply blurs out your screen completely. Now, when you come back in front of the camera, it detects your face based on the metadata it is pulled, and it's able to remove the privacy block, if you like. So that's one thing that we're working on. And we see that as a very sort of practical way of removing the friction and all of those things that you have with traditional passwords. So to your question, we're not eliminating passwords. We're just removing the passwords from being a constant interruption in people's workflow. And for our business, that is a very practical, much needed and much appreciated change that our clinicians are excited to see. Now, there's several other schools of thought, right? Understanding people's typing patterns and all of those sort of things to determine that this is you, this is the way you type, your keystrokes, and all manner of, you can't get 5 experts to agree on which one is robust in terms of, replacing passwords. Like if I go to one more conference and see another sign saying passwords are dead, I'm just going to puke, because passwords are, they're limited, and they are the root of a lot of problems that we deal with in security. But it's one of those things where, till we have some consensus on what the next iteration of this is going to be, I think, at least for me, limits the use of passwords. Making passwords more complex is not the answer, because people just write them down. And I am more open to going with longer passphrases, things that are more memorable, rather than a bunch of gibberish that you don't remember. Funny other story. We do a lot of office refreshes, and the amount of times when we get equipment back from an office that we're refreshing, and behind the keyboard, behind the monitor, we have passwords. And I'm like, yeah, wonderful, right? So you have your 14 character passwords, it's alphanumeric, it's got special characters, all of those tick boxes, but it's not just written down, it is printed out and laminated behind the monitor or the keyboard, and you haven't really achieved anything. I am all for doing away with or changing the way we use passwords today. I am more inclined to reduce the prevalence of passwords and also using passphrases, but I am also researching additional technology around just eliminating passwords altogether. But I just think that as an industry, we're certainly some ways away from having general consensus there.
Yeah, that's fair. I absolutely love the level of insight that you have into the clinician workflow, and how something as simple as a timeout, where, as a security professional, if you're just plugging away on a laptop, going through a checklist of these are the controls. I know you hate that word, but that's the typical word that's used in this setting. These are the controls I have to implement. And you don't have that context, which I personally don't believe you're going to get unless you're talking to your business counterparts and you're trying to understand your user flows. So that level of insight, I think, is what everyone should strive for, to really use security to enable your business, not just hinder it. Let's talk about the big picture. So It's one thing to roll zero trust out for cloud apps, which is the big thing right now. But what about those like older legacy systems that aren't cloud? You're running them on-prem. How do you handle pieces where potentially your modern identity solutions aren't just plug and play with those? How do you fit those into your zero trust strategy, or do you have that problem?
We don't, thankfully. We don't, but I think for some of the more legacy type applications, established methods like things like micro-segmentation, for instance, making sure that, if there's an application that doesn't have the same security profile, the same, security setting, and you can apply the same level of, here comes the C word again, controls as you would with other things, then move it into a different part of the network, limits the amounts of access that it has. And there's some of that within medical where you have a med tech device, so an x-ray machine, for instance. These machines, when they build x-ray machines, for instance, they're not building them for security. They're building them for image quality and the capabilities from a clinical standpoint. And so there are times when we have a device that just doesn't tick all the boxes, and for all intents and purposes, from a security standpoint, can be considered a legacy device. But in the clinical workflow, it's state of the art. It is the modern, whatever standard for them. And understanding the traffic, for me, I usually start with the behavior of this device. What is the data flow? What does that look like? If you have a device that, let's take an X-ray machine, if it only ever needs to communicate to a storage device to store those images or upload them to a cloud, edge to cloud architecture, then it's relatively easy for you to say, I would trust this interaction, but essentially nothing else. And that's where, there are well-established ways of managing that. As a general sort of response to that, we don't deal with a lot of, the legacy technology, luckily for us, across our environment.
Well, I have two final lessons learned type questions. So looking back, what's something that you wish someone had told you before you started on your zero trust journey?
First one would be just lacking a comprehensive plan. And by comprehensive plan, I mean the milestones along the way, the highlighting the little wins along the way. So rather than just going, we're going to do this and we're going to implement this, because a lot of times we talk about zero trust and it is largely a technology journey. It's a technology conversation. Building a plan that brings the business along the way, which kind of leads to the second point, which is around prioritizing user experience. Making sure that you're not implementing overly restrictive policies that end up frustrating users, and not just frustrating the users, but becomes a nightmare for your technology team, the security team to implement. I always have this sort of bowl of spaghetti in my head when I think about zero trust. In traditional authentication workflows, is very linear. It is very, gated, if you like. But zero trust is not. You get this constellation of things that are presented to a decision point, which is run through a policy engine, and then a decision is made. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of things for you to process. Making that as streamlined and as simple as you can is the blueprint for success. If you try to do all of it all at once, you're going to run into a lot of challenges and end up abandoning your plan midway, because it's just too complex. People complain too much, and then you just go back to what you were doing previously.
Those are some great insights. And final question before we let you go. Any parting advice you'd like to share for our audience as they, start or continue their zero trust journey based on our conversation today?
Yeah, I would, something we've talked about, Zach, but I want to kind of frame it this way. I started with talking about the business and talking about our core business systems and how we focused our zero trust efforts there. But there's also the back end. There's also IT, right? Because the whole point of zero trust is you want to reduce risk. And so when you look at IT users, there's a ton of risk that we inherently carry, and we need to focus on that. So within our organization, for instance, one of the key things we did was essentially implementing zero standing privileges, just-in-time provisioning, or this concept of just enough access. And so the idea is a lot of organizations, even those who have very mature security practices, we end up one way or the other taking the easy button approach. And what I mean by that is you have a new team member, for instance, joining the organization, and the amount of times, and we still see this, where someone would simply say, hey, Nemi's joining as another sysadmin. Zach is a sysadmin, so just give Nemi the rights and privileges that Zach has. Now, Zach may have been in the organization for 20 years and has gone through several different roles and journeys and you name it, and may not have had, permissions cleaned up and all of those sort of things. And so I'm coming in day one, inheriting 20 years of privilege and permissions that you have. That's one way of looking at it. The other way, when you think about zero standing privileges, if as an attacker, if you were to break into my account and my account had no privileges, no ability to do much, right? And those privileges were only elevated to me at the time of need, then you've essentially inherited a dummy account and there's not a lot you can do with it. And so another call out, we also use CyberArk. And so with CyberArk, that was one of the core things we did, and essentially implemented things like, just-in-time provisioning access. So you get the access you need to do what you need to do when you need to do it. And outside of that context, you're not sitting on, an encyclopedia of access. And in most cases, we don't even know the level of access that we have. So in just kind of wrapping up here, always think about the two ends of the spectrum. Think about zero trust as enabling the user experience on the front end in a lot of what you do. But on the back end, always think about your privileged users, and you cannot neglect one or the other. They're both as important. But just start small, right? Focus on where it matters most to your organization. Start there. Don't get caught in the hype of everyone has to be on a zero trust journey. You can implement everything that I have talked about today and not call it zero trust. Right? It's just about process optimization, process efficiency, speeding up your onboarding process, user experience, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't have to be called zero trust, but certainly apply the principles of zero trust as you do it. And you should be heading in the right direction if you go about it that way.
I love that ending. So that's all the time we have for today's Zero Trust Journey episode. A massive thank you to our guest for sharing your insights here today. And a huge thanks to our listeners. If you have a zero trust journey to share, please reach out on LinkedIn or on our website, ztjourney.com. Until next time, stay secure, stay curious, and keep exploring the world of zero trust.
Thanks for joining us on Zero Trust Journey. If this episode sparked new ideas or gave you practical insights, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your network. Your support helps us continue bringing you valuable conversations and real-world stories. We'd love to hear from you. Share your feedback or even your own zero trust journey by reaching out to us. Your story could inspire others in the community. Stay tuned for more expert insights, compelling stories, and actionable advice to help you advance your zero trust strategy. Until next time, stay curious and keep making progress on your zero trust journey. See you in the next episode.